Okay, welcome ladies and gentlemen to the panel devoted to the report that the Kosciuszko Institute has authored on the geopolitics of emerging technologies. This report will premiere next week, so stay tuned and look on our social media for the freshly baked publication at the end of the next week. And for now, we begin the first panel dedicated to the promotion of this report. In this panel, we would like to dwell into how and what technologies are being crucial to the current geopolitical rivalry, and we will discuss the main topics and issues addressed in the report. So welcome once again, and I would like to start with a very short statement. So as we observe now, we have entered a new age of great power competition, and this age is to a large extent being centered on the rivalry in the field of emerging technologies. And we could see with the US announcement of the expansion of the Clean Network Initiative, followed by China's global initiative on data security, that we might be heading towards not only the division of global universal internet, the so-called Splinternet, but also we might be heading towards a bifurcation in the global technology management, one that may result in the establishment of two conflicting blocks of nations that produce and operate incompatible technologies. So I would like to start with a set of questions that is supposed to address this issue, but looking specifically at the topics that each one of us have thoughts upon in the report. And I would like to start with a question to Isa. Isa, data is obviously crucial to the functioning of the digital economy. But in your chapter in the report, you also write about features that make data the most attractive geopolitical asset. And this is despite the fact that data, as you write, resembles air, as it is distinguished by replicability, among other features. If so, how should we think about data as a geopolitical asset that can be subject to interstate competition? And what do states get from data? How do they harness the power of data?
Thank you, Michał. Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon also for, I hope, many of the participants gathered in the front of the screens. So, Michał, as for the power of data, I would say that the importance of the data generated through digital technologies and transferred over the internet is growing exponentially. And basically, as a result, the world is also getting data-driven more and more, with data having, as you said, not only the geo-economic impact, but also geopolitical impact. And there are a couple of dimensions which I will explain later on, and which are explained in even more detailed way in the chapter which I provided to the report. I would say that the most crucial aspect of the geopolitical rivalry is, in my opinion, in fact, big data and its advanced analytics. And it is not just because I want to encourage you to read my chapter, but I really think that this is actually crucial. And the big data and advanced analytics was also classified as such disruptive technology by NATO, for instance. So starting from the beginning, digital data is basically detailed machine-readable information available about practically everything. It describes, reflects, and represents the world. As you can see, the mirror over there. So basically, this is like the mirror world, and it is more accurate every day, actually. So this is basically data, and now the volume of data is growing exponentially, as I said, and it stems from increasing popularity of the internet, greater network throughput, the gigantic number of devices connected to the internet, and in the near future, due to the advances in the economy, which is going entirely digital, and within the fourth industrial revolution, we can also expect the so-called second wave of data, with big wave of industrial data. And this dynamic will even fuel the competition, which we can observe between countries. And you mentioned China and the US as the major actors in that competition. And already now, accessing and leveraging data is in fact the major reason of the so-called digital Cold War played between the countries we mentioned. And in the future, I believe that international cyber conflicts may shape up as also as fight for data, and can even determine the result of military conflicts, because thanks to assessing big data and analyzing it appropriately, battlefield advantages will be built also in the future. Then, when coupled with artificial intelligence capabilities, data often is, and in even bigger extent than now, is going to be transforming the digital intelligence knowledge will be again thanks to that transformation of data into digital intelligence and insights, and this intelligence knowledge insights will find also its use even frequent than now in public domain, in information related activities, in decision making processes, and in already mentioned military operations. Basically, I believe that data is and will be the engine of all sorts of value creation. And nowadays, experts already consider data and the information it can generate to be the most significant and attractive geopolitical asset. And I can, for instance, mention and quote Yuval Noah Harari, who stated that, for example, the countries with enough data don't need to send soldiers in a control soldiers into control a country. So yet countries which lag behind in the current race are likely to go bankrupt or become exploited data colonies. So digital data become a strategic asset when it started to be a source of value creation and competitive advantages for not only digital platforms and other organizations, but also states. And this process is basically remodeling the world with the coupling of supply chain, for instance, bans of technologies or export control, because actors noticed the need to new approach of data collection and its possible use in a strategic and systemic way. So in the report, I wrote that in the digital world, the growing importance can thus be seen of maps that show elements such as data traffic, infrastructure for data transmission, data centers, or the localization of headquarters of the biggest digital platforms. And the picture which is emerging from analyzing those maps of the digital world shows now how strongly this new strategic resource, data and infrastructure, are concentrated in China and the US. And basically, these countries have become the main centers of gravity in the new digital world and are determined to gain the maximum geo-economic benefits in the digital data dominated era, and benefits which they will be able to capitalize on, not only in the economic but also in the political and military domain. And very quickly, what are domains what are those domains are. So basically, in the first place, we need to remember that data is a resource that develops the state's information power. So that's the first domain. I can later on maybe concentrate in more detailed way to explain how I understand those domains. Another domain is political power, basically, which will also depend on the proper use of data in order to improve governance processes, decision making, efficiency, as well as achieve budget savings and understand trends. Third one is the use of data for intelligence activities. This is very interesting. I really encourage you to dive deeper into that topic in the chapter. And last but not least, there is an importance of data for military power, which has been already recognized as I mentioned at the beginning by NATO, for instance, as one of the priorities for adapting the alliance to the challenges of the digital world. Big data and analytics make it possible to forecast, support real-time decision-making, and distinguish early success and crisis indications. Digital data exploitation is also recognized as a critical advantage over foes and their forces, and the armed forces capacity to use this resource is increasingly important for operational effectiveness. And as for the conclusions, data presented as such and ability to use it in all those domains, and I probably already in advance answer your next question here, will decide on the state's strategic autonomy, digital sovereignty, and geotechnology position. And for all these reasons, we have recently been watching heightened activity meant to protect and accumulate digital data on the part of countries, organizations, and corporations, which is affecting the idea of free cross-border data flows and the processes which I mentioned, like decoupling, for instance.
Thank you, Isa. And data obviously has to reside somewhere. We either keep it on our devices or we send it to other devices that are located in different parts of the world. Przemysław, you have authored a chapter in the report that is dedicated to cloud computing, where you write that cloud computing market is not free from significant geopolitical considerations, influences, and effects. Could you talk us through why, how, and when does cloud get geopolitical?
Thank you, Michał. Yes, well, of course, but my chapter lifts off where Isa's chapter ends, because data, as you said, has to be somewhere. And although the forecasts are that data will be processed in the future mostly in so-called edge computing, it is still a big market of cloud computing. So in centralized data centers where the storage and processing is being done. Now, how does this tie in with geopolitics? Well, geopolitics being the politics influenced by geography. So if you look at the map that Isa has already mentioned of the locations of data centers, what influences where those data centers are? Well, firstly, where is the customer? Secondly, though, however, how near to the data center is an internet connect point? How well and how fast can you transfer large amounts of data? That's the second. The third is things like geography, meaning temperatures. The colder it is, the better for the data center because energy output is lower. But of course, the fourth point is what's the political and legal environment in the country that the data center is located in, because this has an enormous impact on the data centers. And then this ties it in with politics, because where data centers are located, this country of location of those data centers has jurisdiction over the data center and the data stored therein. And this has enormous impact, because if this is not a rule of law country, then there is no telling what this country can do with the data that is located there, whether it will accept the privacy of the data, or whether it would force, for instance, the data center operator to give access to law enforcement, which may be legitimate, but also to other state agencies for purposes that may not be legitimate from the point of view of the customer whose data is located on this data center. So through the fact that the state where such centers are located, or the state in which those big cloud service providers are registered, has jurisdiction over them, this means that those states have big power of influence over both the actions of those companies as well as over the data that is located on them. And we have seen this with, for instance, this famous Microsoft Ireland case, where US law enforcement wanted to access certain information stored on Microsoft servers in Ireland. Microsoft has denied the US law enforcement the right of access, arguing that since this is in Ireland, US does not have jurisdiction over it. And this has been then solved by the US passing a law specifically allowing US law enforcement access to overseas data, provided that it is held by cloud service operators registered or domiciled in the United States. And so if we look at who are those biggest cloud service operators, we have American companies, Microsoft, Google, Amazon Web Services, and we have Chinese companies, Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba. And this ties it into this geopolitical clash that we are seeing, where there's a lack of trust between those two big players, and where, for instance, the Americans in the Clean Network Initiative also declared the so-called Clean Cloud Initiative, meaning that they will actively prevent certain types of data from being stored on servers controlled by Chinese companies in order to protect intellectual property of American companies or the privacy of data belonging to American citizens. So this ties it in very much into this geopolitical clash that we are seeing.
Thank you, Przemysław. So I guess the very logical next move would be to turn to Michał. And Michał, would you like to comment on that? You represent a company that is actually making decisions on whether locate a data center in a certain state or certain area or not. Could you comment on what have been said already and provide us with a look what are the most important conditions or features that your company is looking at in this respect?
Thank you, Michał, and thank you, Przemek, for nice bridging for what I can say about this. So it's a great story about what you said that was called the New York warrant case, when we were asked by the US government to provide some data that was outside of the US and was about non-US citizen. So we went to the court. We said we will not provide this data. And there was like two stages, and the final outcome of this is a Cloud Act, just like Przemysław said. And that means that this process is now regulated. So if there is limited to some specific, very clearly described situation when the US government can ask for the data and what Microsoft and other companies should do. By the way, we also provided transparency about this, so you can go to the Microsoft pages and we are providing the reports, how many requests we are getting from countries from all over the world. So you can choose your own country and find out how many requests for data were sent to Microsoft, and for how many of them we responded and how. The big problem is here that we are talking about our rights, human rights, rights for privacy, rights for keeping our data, and at the very same time, it's necessary to keep, for example, the national security. So we were also in this type of the situation right after the attack for one of the clubs in Paris a few years ago, and there was a question if there was some data inside Microsoft infrastructure, and we were asked by the French government and later by the US government to provide the answer for this. So why it is so important and why Microsoft is doing such a thing like going to the US, to the court with the US government? Pretty brave, right? That means because if you are moving from products to services, and today's world is moving, IT is moving from products to services. Isa talk about data, about the big data, about the huge amount of data, Himalayas of data. So you need a cloud computing to manage this. And there is more and more services that it's really not possible, even not possible to do on your own infrastructure, or this is not economically, doesn't make a lot of sense to do this on your own infrastructure. So for us, for Microsoft, for other cloud vendors, the word trust is one of the key words. So we need to work together with the other stakeholders how to build the trust in the IT environment, in the digital environment. And this is one of the very, very key part of this. For example, if we're talking about the artificial intelligence, so we have the special committee that is always deciding if our technology can be used for a particular purpose. So, and they are very, very serious. It's doing no harm. It's one of the key challenges. So thinking about data, thinking about the geopolitics, going into this, let's say, I don't want to use the Cold War. It's a little too early to talk like this. But the pace of the progress in technology, the new technologies are really coming fast. 5G, IoT, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. They are all just, you can touch with your hand, and they are coming very, very fast. The word trust, the word how the companies like Microsoft could deliver our services to the customers is really critical. And once again, what Przemysław said in his speech, it was like he said there are four things that are making where the data are located. First is business. First are where the customers are, just like you mentioned this. The second is the proximity of the data between the place where they are processed and the data. In the world of 5G and IoT is really critical. Cooling, last but not least, political environment, and that's highly important for us. We are very active in many aspects to keep this trust for the technology, keep the trust that we as a company, we can deliver trusted service to our customers.
Thank you, Michał. And since you mentioned trust so many times, trust in digital affairs, in digital management, and in cybersecurity is also managed by processes such as certification and standardization. So, Magdalena, you write with your colleagues in the report about the importance of those processes to cybersecurity. What is the geopolitical background of those processes? What global trends do you see right now in this regard that might bear significance to interstate geopolitical competition?
Well, hello, everyone. I believe the geopolitical context has been already some kind of described by the rest of the panel. Like we really are in the interesting place right now. It's not only about data and economic data, because it used to be only about data and the property of the data, right? And the discussion who will have the ownership of our data, and the whole like discussion, maybe it even should be the human right for the people to have the ownership on by them data. But last year we saw very clearly with 5G, for example, the paradigm shifted to the technology also. And right now we are not only discussing who will have the property of the data, we are also discussing who will have the property of the technology, like in the 5G context. And here is an interesting situation. We have like companies from many countries, third countries, not the European Union countries, who are preparing the solution, technological solution to build the 5G network in Europe. And as Europe, as such, we don't really have the definition what we believe is our digital sovereignty. Is it about the data or the technology or both them? We don't know it yet. The only definition we have so far is Tallinn manual, and it's not the law, which is like common for everyone. So from our perspective, this is where Europe can really like find its ground, since we don't really have the ownership of the technologies. And we don't really have the big companies who has this ownership on the data of Europeans. We can prepare the ecosystem here in Europe, which will force these companies to follow some kind of rules, right? And these rules would be certification and standardization. So in the 5G context, for example, the interesting was last year what was happening and what is going on right now with all the toolbox about the 5G and the process of standardization somehow and risk assessment for all the Europe to make it Europe-wide assessment, risk assessment for 5G. But also we have the Cybersecurity Act, which part of that it's dealing strictly with certification and standardization in European Union. So the idea is like, even we don't have the technology, we will force the other companies to follow our European Euro. Is some kind of the GDPR standard, right? In Europe, we created the GDPR regulation, and now the companies which are not European companies but want to operate here in Europe needs to follow the GDPR rules and protect the data protection of European citizens. And this is the attention to do the same in Europe, basically, but in the way of technology, of new technologies. So what is happening right now, it's ENISA is already finished the process of standardization, so-called common criteria. And right now we're gonna have the European standard for that. And the other, the next step is the 5G certification and standardization, which will be very crucial in this whole discussion about the new technology and how the 5G, and because of that, the whole new ecosystem in Europe will be created. That's why we see the certification and standardization as the part, not only like this will be important factor, but it will be a part of our European sovereignty, because it's not so easy to ban some vendors or companies, because when you do it, you have less to choose and the market is smaller, right? So what probably will be smarter from the European perspective is to create standards and certificates which will apply for these companies. And that's how we see the digital sovereignty in this area. And that's why as a company, NASC is working really hard to put that certification scheme here in front.
Thank you, Magdalena. You kind of addressed the next question I was about to ask all of you, but I hope we will still get back to that. But before that, Theodor, you represent Exatel, one of the leading Polish network providers. And when we think about geopolitics of digital technologies, the most obvious element of digital technologies is of course, the digital infrastructure, the so-called digital belts and roads. So in this respect, could you provide us with summary of the most striking examples and the most vivid significance of digital infrastructure that is still subjected to laws of geopolitics to a large extent?
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Well, it's true that there is a problem of ownership, not only of the data and technology, but also the ownership of the infrastructure. And for many years, we used to believe that internet has no nationality. And in the beginning of Polish national internet, there was such a fairy tale told around, and we all believed in that. But soon afterwards, we had a few quite striking examples. What can happen if the infrastructure of a certain country is abused by some actors? Either they may be state actors, but there also may be like hacktivist groups or whoever who tries to impact the stability of the country. In report being authored by one of my colleagues, indeed there are a few examples of what can be done if a certain country is just simply cut out of internet, and you can imagine what would happen if we had such a blackout right now during this event. We would be very astonished and quite upset. And due to the global nature of internet, which goes very, very deep into the society, this feeling would be very, very much magnified. In my area of personal interest, we had a large attack on Estonia, which was mentioned during a previous conference, as far as I remember. There were people from Estonia talking about this attack, and in fact we have to face this fact that we have to watch oil and gas pipes, but we also have to watch for internet pipes, because they can be attacked in many ways. They can be attacked on a physical level, but they can also be attacked on a logical level.
Thank you, Theodore. So one of the issues that have surfaced already in this discussion is the question of the so-called digital sovereignty. And we see now more and more how state and non-state actors in world politics evoke this idea. Sometimes they refer to it as digital sovereignty, of cyber sovereignty, or digital autonomy. And this is a trend that we can observe nowadays in the European Union. We saw the Ursula von der Leyen agenda for Europe 2020 that included the postulate of Europe, of the fact that Europe should pursue actually digital autonomy. But also we see it very often in the words of Commissioner Thierry Breton, who evokes the French understanding or the French notion of digital sovereignty, or the souveraineté numérique. But then if we look to other states in other parts of the world, such as China, we can also see how the state authorities are adopting the idea of digital sovereignty. For instance, President Xi Jinping talked about it during the World Internet Conference in Wuhan 5 years ago. So in your assessment, I would like to ask you, what are the key building blocks of this notion? What are the elements that make up for digital sovereignty as an idea, a regulative idea, because this idea is used to actually pursue actions. So we plan what we're gonna do in order to achieve digital sovereignty. And in your perspective, does it differ in any way in different parts of the world? So is the European idea of digital sovereignty any different to the one in China or the one in Russia or other parts of the world? And I would like to start with Przemysław Roguski. Przemysław, would you walk us through what is the French understanding of digital sovereignty? What is the German understanding of this idea, and how is it understood in other parts of the world?
Well, that's a fascinating topic, because we can see that well, the Chinese were first with this idea, and then it was quite criticized, for them cutting themselves off from the world internet, and now Europe is following suit, because now Europe is not dictating the terms, but is being subjected to the terms. So we have to somehow guard our own sovereignty. So I maybe start with the French and then go over to the Germans, because the French have been quite fast in thinking in these terms as well. I think they coined this term souveraineté numérique in 1998. It was Pierre Bélanger who did that, and it was picked up by the French politics and politicians who have developed French policy into this area. There have been some reports for the French Senate, for the French General Assembly, where basically the rapporteurs have stated that in order to protect vital interests of the French Republic, it is necessary to guarantee sovereignty in the digital domain. Now, what are the threats to this sovereignty of the French Republic in the digital domain? And maybe let's define sovereignty, or what they mean with sovereignty. So sovereignty is basically the absolute authority of a state within a certain territory. And how can this be threatened? Well, if you have a country, say the United States, because most of the French examples go against the United States, that has jurisdiction over cloud service providers, and can then, through their law enforcement, access data of persons who are within Europe, within France, and whose data is even stored on servers in France. And through this Cloud Act that has already been mentioned by Michał and myself, this is now possible. And so this has been seen as a threat to the sovereignty of the French state in the digital realm, which needs to be rectified. How? By building up European technological sovereignty, European cloud providers, or a regulatory scheme that would somehow insulate providers operating in Europe from the long arm of the French of the American law enforcement. And the same goes, of course, to any other country potentially in the world, but they mentioned France, the US, and China in this regard. Now, the Germans, they are also quite on edge with US legislation. Their idea is to develop maybe not cloud giants as the French would like, but some sort of a cooperative cloud, which has interchangeable access points. It's open to smaller and medium-sized businesses, and this is done through the Gaia-X program that is now also being held up by the European Commission as one of the priorities for the next few years. So what they are worried about is so-called data sovereignty. So access to data from entities, law enforcement that is not or should not have access to this. And this goes even so far that, for instance, regional data protection authorities in Germany do not want data from schools or so forth being stored on servers operated by Microsoft, because then they fear that this may be accessed by US law enforcement. How probable this is, whether US law enforcement is interested in the grades of German school children, that's another topic, but you see the extent of worry in Germany. And so this is the French and European idea, which has then been taken up by Ursula von der Leyen and which is now official European policy. And if you ask me, how does this differ from the Chinese approach? Well, cynically, you could say it doesn't very much. I mean, it's they want to regulate, we want to regulate. The question is, of course, on which terms, by which values. You know, we see ourselves as rule of law countries where human rights will be protected and the legal process will be guaranteed. And the problem with the Chinese side is they want to regulate in terms that we do not understand and that are not open and transparent and potentially not very keen to implement human rights protection.
Thank you, Przemysław. Magdalena, you already touched upon this topic in your previous remark, but I know that you're probably gonna point us to the global direction and explain to us how this process got into place some time ago already. Could you drive us through why and how this debate on digital sovereignty started, and how does it look from a global perspective or a perspective of global management of technology?
So actually, the debate was ongoing even before someone called it like digital sovereignty. Like this is the new term, like really like the kind of baseline which happening this year, for example, in European Union. Like this is the baseline everyone is using, but actually what we are talking about is in the broader context of internet management and who will have the power over the internet, and if the internet will be the whole big internet for everyone, or do we'll have the internet in the different internet in the country. And this is what's going on in China, for example. This is what's going on in Russia. Like Russia last year have its own law, which was establishing the national Russia internet. So this is like the global discussion which is going on from 2003, when the first group in United Nations was created to discuss this subject and the whole idea of global management of the internet. And then everything what happened with ICANN and IANA was just steps to do the multi-stakeholder approach. And we had countries like US and Europe, which are all of multi-stakeholders approach, but also countries like China and Russia were not really a fan of this idea. But I do believe like this discussion about the digital sovereignty is so crucial right now, because we actually can see with the modern technologies and emerging technologies being so important, like 5G, like Internet of Things, how big impact it could have. And states started to realize that it's not enough to have the cybersecurity system in place, for example, because in the future perspective, it's not only about how to protect our citizens and the vital services like critical infrastructure or critical services for our society. It's also about how big power in the internet will the state have, and who will have the power to decide about the data of the citizens of the state. And the huge turning point, in my opinion, was 2016 and the whole Cambridge Analytica problem, right? And states suddenly understood that there is much more players than the states here, because we also have the digital platforms who actually had the ownership on the data. So this whole discussion about the digital sovereignty is on the one hand, it's about the data and the ownership of the data. It's about the infrastructure and the technology and the ownership about it. But also, this is like creating totally new role for the internet, and answering the question what kind of internet we would like to have in 10 years perspective, for example, because decisions which are making now and which decision makers are creating in Europe, in United Nations, or in other parts of the world like China, Japan, or Russia, will have a huge impact on the internet as a common good somehow in the future. And this is why we really need to stay focused and really find the answer of what is digital sovereignty in Europe, I believe. Because this is something we are lacking. Like French and German perspective is different than the perspective of countries like Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovenia, right? Because of the cultural differences, because of the historical differences. And it will be not easy to find the common ground for this definition in Europe. And if we will not do it, we will lose badly as a Europe and as a multi-stakeholder approach to the internet, because the other side of the countries, like Russia, China, and the whole bloc, they knew exactly what they're doing. They have the definition in place, they have the strategies, and they are not discussing this problem anymore because they already find them answers. So I believe this year is very important also in the way the European legislation is shifting, like the new Digital Services Act and how it will be look like, because it will impact globally many companies around the globe and will set the new rules for the internet in Europe and probably the whole world as well. The NIS directive revision, right? What will happen with a privacy regulation, and will we finally have this regulation? Because without that, as Europe and many countries has many different political background, historical background, and cultural background, we don't really find the answer of how we would like the internet to look like in 10 years' time, for example. And again, about our article, sorry, like, but I really believe that certification and standardization in this area is really important, and this will be the core of the discussion, because we can't really follow the huge race in the AI, right? It's really hard to the Europe with our data economy and our data policy to follow China, for example, because they don't care about data protection, for example. So it's much easier to create the new ways for AI to exist and do all the tests, for example, right? But when we put the standardization and certification in place, we will have some kind of assurance that this artificial intelligence in Europe is at least trying to think more like the European people, less than the Chinese people, for example. That this artificial intelligence will be more European as a core. It will value human rights, for example.
Thank you, Magdalena. Isa, you in the report, you analyze different strategies that states adopt in order to safeguard or control or build a wall around their data sets. And you mentioned, you also mentioned different tools that they use to capture data and control data, but you also write about the Balkanization axis, which you portray as a set of states that act similarly when it comes to data protection or data control or data sovereignty. Would you like to comment on how or what ways of pursuing digital sovereignty or data sovereignty you observe nowadays in different parts of the world, and what strategies and what tools are being used to capture and control data in this respect by states?
Thank you, Michał. This is really broad question, so probably I would encourage you to read more details on that in the report, especially that I believe that we are running out of the time. But indeed, I tried to present several ways of how countries are trying to control data. And balkanization of the internet, the idea of dividing the internet, which is also called the cyber balkanization, sometimes even split internet. However, this is a little bit different. scope of this discussion has evolved over recent years, and it refers to the fragmentation of the global internet into several smaller nationally administrated internet networks divided along political borders. So, for instance, China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea have been trying for many years to secure the borders of their internet, not least to protect the data and information created by their citizens and residents on digital platforms. And similarly, in the near future, many other countries may want to create their national internets. I think that the most advanced country in that respect is China, isolated by the Great Firewall of China. They started this process in 1997. Then in 2002, they launched the Chinese internet. It allows the Communist Party to monitor each and every online activity of its citizens and to implement advanced filtering and censorship system that blocks them from accessing, for example, Google search engine or portals such as Facebook, Twitter. Then another, I would say, the process which is going parallelly is that the Chinese companies are also accessing global market and provide services and sell products not only to countries' citizens but also the users in other countries. And this is, for instance, also highlighted by some decision makers that this way China is able to gather vast amounts of data, not only from Chinese citizens, but also from around the world. And this is, in fact, also the reason why we can observe the decoupling of supply chain. It is not only about the security of supply chain disrupted by COVID-19, but also about the security of digital infrastructure, which includes processing, gathering, transferring, and soon to be also generating massive amounts of data, as I said. And I think that the assumption behind decoupling in many countries is now that once the decoupling will occur in certain processes, we may have a more cyber-secure and resilience infrastructure and components and more autonomy and ability to control it, which in fact means that we will increase security and control over data. So global competition in that respect for data takes place at many technological levels, not only at the internet infrastructure for data transmission, that is to say the internet and cloud infrastructure level, but also computer equipment, hardware, platforms, algorithms for analyzing data, that is software, mobile application. And data can be collected at all of these levels, which is why countries are now currently competing on 5G networks, cloud computing, AI, quantum computing. We can see, for instance, the decision made by India and US recently on imposing restrictions on Chinese mobile applications like the TikTok, for instance. This is, in my opinion, also the example of these strategies or actions that are aimed to control data. I would say that those two measures are kind of hard measures, which are resulting in the real and infrastructural changes to the global internet and technological landscape. But also many countries are trying to protect the data generated by their citizens in the way which we can call more soft measures imposed on controlling the data. So maybe I can finish here, like saying that we have hard and soft measures. More can be found in our report, as you said, next week.
Thank you, Iza. So, Michał and Todor, I will have final questions, but I would kindly ask you to comprise yourself into 2 minutes answer. Michał, obviously, global companies benefit from globalization. And we could say that those moves to raise borders or raise walls in cyberspace or put halt to the international data transfers, as we could see recently with the recent ruling by the European Court of Justice, they create environment that is very challenging for companies that want to operate in multiple places in the world. So how you look at this question of digital sovereignty, and from your perspective, can digital sovereignty be achieved through cooperation or through international cooperation, or does it have to lead to some sort of technological autarky where state is closing itself and tries to develop its own native technologies without the influence of external actors?
Thank you very much. The most interesting part is that you have mentioned only the big players. But in fact, we can name in Poland a number of our partners. They do not care about the local market. They are present in the Middle East, they are present in Western Europe, they are present in the US. And the way, what was enabler? It was the cloud. In this case, Microsoft Cloud. So one of the reasons why we're putting data center in Poland was to have this data center closer to the very innovative, intelligent people who can go and, let's say, conquer the world. So this is not only the case for the, we don't think about right now, we don't think about the countries that in Poland, there are only the Polish company that are selling, and in Czech Republic are only the Czech Republic IT software companies, and in Germany are only Germans. No, it doesn't work like this. So there is a lot of the international cooperation in this. There is a lot of the companies that are selling in a number of the countries. So this globalization is the key element for them. And closing or balkanization of the internet, even in Europe, to have 27 different markets, it's killing this Polish company. Simple like that. So we believe that there is a place for making this on one hand digital sovereignty, and on the other hand a trusted environment where people can place the data and where people can go with their processes. Just like Magdalena said, this certification and standardization is absolutely okay as long as there is a transparent process. On the first thing, and the second, there is no discriminatory or non-preferring conditions inside this. So if these three conditions are met, it's okay. So the companies, no matter global or local, will comply with this regulation. So when you think about not only about, stop thinking about the big guys like Microsoft. Think about the local companies all across Europe that they are benefiting from the globalization or Europeization of the markets. They can go for the market, sell their products, making their economy higher, because very often there is no local customers for their offer. Simple like that. And that's the case that we also should keep in mind when we are thinking about the globalization and digital sovereignty.
Thank you, Michał. I purposely used the word global companies, not big companies. But thank you for your answer. Todor, one last question, and I would be very grateful if you could stretch yourself to 2 minutes of answer. From your perspective, this notion of digital sovereignty, does it have to lead to autarky or tech nationalism or some sort of inward-looking perspective on developing national technology as against international technologies or technologies coming from external places, external providers, external vendors?
I mean, of course, it is important to have independent technology, and you may know it or not. In the beginning of COVID, there was a complete closing of delivery from Cisco, and it occurred that that a very small piece of technology cannot be mounted in many I mean in devices, because it cannot be supplied by Cisco. So it was a very striking point that you have to control technology if you want to be cyber sovereign. But I would like to add another comment on that. So in Exatel, we are working on our own network equipment as original vendor. So we are entering the new role just in this direction. But in mathematics, it is so that there are problems that you cannot solve in 2D, but you can solve them in 3D. And there is, my chapter in the report is devoted on space, which adds another dimension, because the logic, like what Isa used to say about the great Chinese firewall, this is a logic of broadband connections which are terrestrial. And now consider the situation when Elon Musk has put 12,000 satellites on orbits, and the internet is simply everywhere. So every Chinese citizen can stick a very simple antenna and get immediate access to the internet. From a Chinese point of view, this is complete nightmare. Okay, because the information comes from the third dimension, and you cannot do anything about it. So there is very interesting project of European Space Agency called Hydron. We observe this project at Exatel. We counseled the Polish Ministry of Science, which is devoted to creation of the complete over terrestrial optical network of high throughput. And if such technologies, space technologies emerge, they may add a completely new dimension to the discussion we used to have so far. Because when Michał was speaking about proximity, my thought was that nowadays, maybe you agree, maybe not, proximity is not measured in kilometers; it is measured in milliseconds. You see, so the idea that some countries are close neighbors and some are apart gets completely different. It is the reorientation of the whole arena. So for instance, having a direct connection to the US internet, it is a strategic asset from a Polish point of view, or from 3Cs initiative point of view. So the problem of who owns the network infrastructure, which is between two partners, becomes very important in terms of technical possibilities to cut this internet, or to pick the data from the transmission. And if I may have very short comment, Europe has completely overslept the technological race concerning data storage, and also concerning encryption. That's why we have Michał here and not some other Michał from Brussels. And now they are trying to have the ground back, and this is what Magda has been talking about, that we will not start to develop our own products, but we will standardize them, and in this way we will have the cards in hand again. And there is one more interesting attempt, which is called EuroQCI, which is an initiative to introduce quantum encryption to the world of telecommunication. And of course, there is no time to discuss it in detail. We also observe this process from a close distance. And there is very interesting initiative that, because it is not enough that you obtain the data, you still have to understand it. And if you look at encryption acts that are discussed in many places in the world, there is an open discussion which goes in this direction, and this European initiative is close in direction to these attempts from other countries, that maybe we should encrypt our data so that it is no longer important who owns the actual physical infrastructure, because the data inside cannot be understood by anybody. And let's be us who hold the keys to this process. Okay, so
thank you, Theodore. So with this, we conclude the first of many panels to come that will actually deal with the content of the report that will be published next week on the Kosciuszko Institute website. We encourage you to stay alerted and download the very moment it appears online. And for now, I would like to thank you for this very, very insightful conversation, and see you next time. And our guests were Isabella Albrecht, chair of the Kosciuszko Institute and president of the organizing committee of the European Cybersecurity Forum, Cybersec. Thank you, Isa. Przemysław Roguski, lecturer and chair of public international law at the Jagiellonian University and expert of the Kosciuszko Institute. Thank you, Przemysław. Michał Jaworski, technology director and member of the board at Microsoft. Magdalena Wrzosek, head of strategic analysis and emerging technologies at NAST. And Theodor Buchner, information technology security analyst at Exatel and scientist at the Faculty of Physics at the Warsaw University of Technology. Thank you and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
bye.